Thanks a lot, friends, for being here. And thank you, Alan, also for being here. And, I know how busy you are, and yet you took your time out for us. Thanks a lot. And before I hand over the mic to you for a brief introduction of the subject, before we start our conversation, I'd like to give a brief introduction of you to our regular participants and also who are joining us new this week. For those who may not know, but many will know, of course, Alan Mikhail is a very prominent and renowned scholar of history, and right now he's a professor of history and chair of the Department of History at Yale University. And he's widely recognized for his work in Middle Eastern and global history. He is the author of 3 previous books and over 30 scholarly articles that have received multiple awards in the fields of Middle Eastern and environmental history, including the Fuat Koprulu, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrongly, Koprulu Book Prize from the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association for Under Usman's Tree, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and Environmental History. That was the name of the book. He got the prize for that book. It's titled Under Usman's Tree. And Roger Owen Book Award. He also received this award, the Roger Owen Book Award of the Middle East Studies Association for Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt and Environmental. That prize was won, that award was won for the book Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt and Environmental History. In 2018, he received the Annelies Mayer Research Award of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for internationally distinguished humanities scholars and social scientists. His writing has appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journals. So he's a scholar of this prominence, and therefore the participants who are here today are quite lucky enough to listen to him and, of course, interact with him. So therefore, with this brief introduction, I would like to hand over the mic to Alan now, before we start our conversation for a brief introduction of the subject. Thank you, Alan. Over to you.
Thank you, Faiz. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. It's morning for me, evening for you. I'm really happy to be with you all today, and I look forward to our conversation. I'll just say a brief few words about the book that I published last year entitled God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire and the Making of the Modern World. And then the bulk of our time, I think, will be in conversation, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So this book is about the period from 1470 to 1520, which is the life of Sultan Selim, the 9th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. For those of us who maybe don't think about the Ottoman Empire that often, when we do, we might think of 1453, the conquest of Constantinople. We might think of the sick man of Europe, the end of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and the early 20th century. We might think of Suleiman the Magnificent, probably the most well-known Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. My book focuses on the period between 1453 and the reign of Sultan Selim, on a 50-year period that I think is crucial for understanding world history and the place of the Ottoman Empire in world history. So that's the goal of the book, is to help us to think about the impact of the Ottoman Empire on global affairs in these 50 years between 1470 and 1520. To do that, I focus on one figure, Selim, in part because he is the Sultan who undertakes the largest single expansion of the Ottoman Empire in its history. In 1516 and 1517, he leads his armies against the Mamluk Empire and conquers and eventually absorbs all of the territory of the Mamluk Empire, which was based in Cairo, into his Ottoman Empire. And this, for me, is central to the story of the book and central to understanding the role of the Ottoman Empire in global history in this period. Along the way, though, I tell the story of some crucial aspects of the empire. Selim's battle for succession against his older half-brothers and how that plays out in the dynastic politics of the empire, his relationship with his mother and father, the role of the empire in expanding eastward in Anatolia in this period. Selim's first major posting in the empire is as governor of Trabzon, a city on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea. That was very important for the kind of eastward ambitions of the empire in this period, just after the defeat of the Byzantine Empire. It also proves important for his sultanate later on, because it's during his governorship in Trabzon where he's introduced to some of the enemies that he will come to battle later in his life. And it's also during that period that he cultivates some of the relationships that will be important for him later on when he seizes the throne. I spend a good deal of time discussing Selim's wars. So I mentioned the Mamluk, the war against the Mamluks already. He also leads a major campaign against the Safavid Empire, the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, which is the first major war between the Ottomans and the Safavids that leads to a victory for the Ottomans. And that will begin a couple centuries of war between the Safavids and the Ottomans. And then I discuss some aspects of his late life right before he passes away. Along the way, I expand the story to understand what was going on outside of the Ottoman Empire in this period and how the Ottomans affected those geopolitical forces. So some of the things that I discuss are the expansion of Europe and eventually Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean. This happens obviously in 1492. And I'm interested in the ways in which the Ottomans and other Muslims are important for understanding that moment of colonization. I'm interested in the religious politics of the world in this period. This is the period that some scholars have identified as being one of confessionalization, whereby various states around the world tie their fortunes to various religions. So in the Ottoman case, Sunni Islam; in the Shia case, in the Safavid case, Shia Islam. In Europe, we can think about the Catholic powers and eventually the Protestant states as well. So I'm interested in what 1516, 1517 means for that kind of politics of religion in the early modern world. This is also obviously the period in which the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean worlds become more closely linked through various European voyages, Vasco da Gama and others, and the Ottoman role in that story. And again, 1516, 1517 is a key aspect of that, because with the conquest of Egypt, this is the first time that the Ottomans have a port that allows them to access the Indian Ocean directly through the Red Sea. I'm also interested in more specific things. Martin Luther, for example, wrote quite a lot about the Ottomans. And so I'm curious as to the connections between Selim's conquests in the same year and Martin Luther's 95 Theses. I'm interested in the growth of some commercial relations, again, between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world. So these are some of the ways that I try to intersect the story of the Ottoman Empire and the world, again, in this period between 1470 and 1520. Those are the very broad brushstrokes of the story. There's a lot more detail there, obviously, and I look forward to getting into some of that in our conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That was, I think, good enough, Alan. In fact, I want to begin by asking you, right at the beginning of your book, you write that you try to equate Selim with the Christ and say that just as there was a period before and after the Christ era, there was an empire and world before and after Selim. In fact, that's how important you think he is. So was there any specific reason, or, I mean, because of the overall contribution of Selim to that? What made you equate? Of course, you said that the Christians may be upset with this, but then you did say that.
Right. Right. I mean, that's first of all, the linguistic flourish that I'm trying to make to point to some of the importance of Selim as a global figure. And so let me tell you a little bit about what I mean. So first of all, if we confine ourselves simply to Ottoman history, so 600 years, of Ottoman history, right, from roughly 1300 until its end in World War I. Selim clearly is perhaps the most pivotal, certainly one of the most pivotal sultans in that, precisely because of the expansion that he undertakes. So before Selim's period, before his rule, the Ottoman Empire is an empire of the Balkans and Western Anatolia. It is a majority Christian empire. The subjects of the empire are majority Christian. And it's a rival state to many others around the Mediterranean. It's not at all dominant. It's not at all inferior. It's a middling kind of state in this period, even after 1453. But with Selim's expansion, his conquest of the Mamluk Empire, this almost triples the size of the empire. It makes it an empire on 3 continents. It wins some of the most important cities of the Mediterranean: Jerusalem, Cairo, Aleppo. It makes the empire, for the first time in its history, a majority Muslim empire, the subjects of the empire. It wins for the Ottomans Mecca and Medina. It completely changes the demographics and the cultural and religious makeup of the empire. It gives the empire the borders it will have roughly, of course, some of the borders will change slightly, but roughly until its end in the 20th century. So this single expansion affects the empire more than anything else, I would argue, in its 600-year history. So, there's clearly a watershed there between before and after Selim. If we then expand the aperture a little bit to look, beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire to the world, I would argue that Selim's period is also pivotal for world history for some of the reasons I've already stated, but I'll give you a little more detail here. One is that after Selim's expansion, the Ottomans become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. They control the Mediterranean coastline from the outskirts of Vienna along the Adriatic coast, all the way around the Eastern Mediterranean, down around North Africa, all the way west to Algeria. So almost the entire eastern and southern coast of the Mediterranean. This gives them the power of economic blockades to the east. This gives them the power of naval control of a lot of the coastline of the Mediterranean, and imparts in the European imagination an understanding that the Ottomans, Islam, is a millennial enemy that has to be thought of as such. That this is the primary enemy of Christendom around the Mediterranean. Part of this, of course, is the story of the East. And as part of this control of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottomans control access to much of the Indian Ocean world. And this is also pivotal for understanding issues around global trade, of understanding issues of geopolitics, and eventually of understanding part of the reason that the Atlantic becomes so important for Europe later. That is part of the story of the creation of the Atlantic world, is the fact that the Ottomans and other Muslim powers are so dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean. Europe is grasping for some other source of power. And it's not at all clear that, at least for the first century, that anything is going to come of Atlantic colonies for Europe, but eventually it will prove its worth. So, those are some of the ways in which the period of Selim's rule, which is short, his rule is only 8 years. But again, the focus of my book is really that 50-year period between 1470 and 1520. So thinking about the Ottomans in that period helps us to understand much of what will happen for the next 500 years.
Great. And of course, your sources for this, as you point out in your book, where basically you took it from Salim Name, and I think which he said that is the biggest corpus of writings on Selim there. But then there was a review which I read in the Financial Times where he said that that's more of an hagiographical account. But of course you do mention that, but you also point out 2 other accounts. So I think these other accounts combined with Salim Name does give us an excellent picture of what Selim represented and I mean his achievements, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, any historical source will have its shortcomings, and one has to understand the politics and the agenda of any kind of historical source.
Yes.
So the Selim Name is a rather hagiographic source that's written long after Selim's reign. But it's indispensable for understanding that period and for understanding the place of Selim in Ottoman history and the way that Ottoman thinkers thought about him. So that's only, as you say, one of the sources I use.
Yes.
I use chronicler accounts from places like Damascus and Cairo during the Mamluk, the war with the Mamluks. I use the accounts of Italians who are present in the Ottoman Empire in various periods. Spanish accounts of the Ottomans and of the New World. So I try to use whatever sources I can find from that period to tell this story.
Actually, the reality is, the Ottoman state initially ruled over a majority of Christian world, right? Mm-hmm. Much before the Muslim world came under its domain. So how do you explain that?
Well, okay, so it is very important, and I think continually remind us Ottoman historians and historians of other places that for over 200 years, the majority of people living under Ottoman rule were Orthodox Christians of one kind or another, right? There are Muslims, there are Jews, yes. There are others. But for the most part, they are acculturated Greek Orthodox Christians. And that has to do with the fact of simply where the Ottomans ended up. The people who would become the Ottomans ended up in Anatolia, yes. During the period of Byzantine rule in Anatolia. So when the Ottomans enter Anatolia, they sort of become one of a number of small tribal principalities built around family networks that are able to get some territory from the Byzantine state. Sometimes they pay taxes to the state, sometimes not. And eventually, over a long period, the Ottomans will emerge as one of the most dominant of these forces and then grow from there. But they're entering into a Byzantine milieu that is Greek and Orthodox. So as they expand, it's not surprising that the people they begin to rule over are former subjects of the Byzantine Empire. But it's important, again, to remember that for a period that's essentially as long as the United States has been an independent country, the Ottoman Empire was a majority Christian state. And that only changes during Selim's rule with his conquest of the Mamluk Empire. What does that mean for thinking about the Ottoman Empire as a state and its politics and its place in the world? Well, one is, there's a long historiography about did the Ottomans simply adopt Byzantine practice? And is that part of the reason for their success? The answer is sort of yes and no. On the culturalist side, part of the argument there is that Muslims could have never achieved the heights of the Ottoman Empire. They basically adopted Christian practice and kind of rejiggered it under Ottoman rule, but we should think of it simply as Christian practice. Okay. There's another side that says, there was a conscious strategy on the part of the Ottomans to adopt the precedent of the places in which they were ruling, to say, okay, we are now the powers in control. We are not going to change your local circumstances. Your elders will continue to be your elders. The amount of taxes you pay will be the same or maybe even lower. We're going to simply rubber stamp local practice as long as you recognize our sovereignty. So to make Ottoman rule very easy for those who are entering the empire. And that is indeed something that you see throughout these early decades and centuries of Ottoman rule, is that the Ottomans are very interested in absorbing populations and winning them over to their side. So that's something that we have to think about in a very real way. I think also this the politics of a minority Muslim dynastic family ruling over a majority Christian population plays out in other ways as well. So one is the Ottomans are famous for the amount of autonomy that they give to non-Muslim populations in the empire in this early period, and in some ways throughout its history until we might say the very end. And I think some of that comes out of this early politics. the Ottomans in some ways had to reconcile themselves to the population they were ruling over, to the majority Christian population. They could not exert themselves in terms of trying to convert Christian subjects or something like that to Islam, because they needed, again, to win them over to their side. And so you see that kind of tradition of the local autonomy for religious communities maintaining throughout certainly the early modern centuries in the Ottoman Empire. So I don't think it's disconnected from that early history of ruling over a majority Muslim non-Muslim population for 200 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. In fact, and where does Columbus come in? Because your argument in the book is that his main intention was to destroy Islam. And in fact, he sailed to India, hoping that he will take the help of some Indian sultan, a Muslim sultan, to finish off the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, where does he come in? Obviously, he was coming on behalf of the Spanish Empire, right? I mean, his patrons were the Spanish and the Catholics in Spain.
Yeah.
And how does he come in the picture?
Yeah, so he comes in the picture obviously because 1492 is an integral part of understanding the world, yes, you know, at the turn of the 16th century.
Yes.
And my argument in the Columbus part of the book is not that destroying Islam was the only thing that Columbus was concerned about, or even the absolute most important, but that it was certainly one of his motivations. And you see that in his writings. He's very explicit about that. You know, the passage that you're referencing here comes from the first few pages of his travel log on the first voyage across the Atlantic, in which he talks about finding the Grand Khan of India, converting him to Christianity, and helping the Europeans to destroy Islam in the middle. And I think historians have tended to forget that. In Columbus's mind, the Atlantic voyages were about not only finding a route to India, but also an alternative route to India, but also to battle against Islam. And he's very explicit about that, coming just a few months after the conquest of Granada in southern Spain. So yes, the role of Christianity in Columbus's life is a very integral one. He is clearly a person who is a believer, and he is shaped throughout his life, I argue in the book, by the encounter between Christendom and Islam. So the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, but also Muslim states in North Africa before the Ottomans conquered North Africa, and then of course Muslims in Spain. And so part of the argument with Columbus, and the reason that he figures in, is because he is very symbolic of the notion that Islam and the Ottomans are embedded in the European imagination in this period as enemies, as a threat that has to be dealt with in some radical way. And that in tracing out Columbus's life, we can see that that Islam comes to shape even something as historically consequential and seemingly unrelated to Islam as the colonization of the Caribbean, beginning in 1492 and going on from there. So that's part of the way that I want to speak about the place of Islam in the world in this period, is by showing just how far its impacts went.
In fact, Islamophobia has its roots in America from this time, right? That's what you say in the book.
Well, I don't say that in the book, actually. There are various, journalists who have said that.
Okay.
But
sorry, I'm getting it wrong.
No. That's fine. But the kernel of your question is right. I mean, I do think, and this is something that I wrestled with in the book about how to present, is that I do think that even before 1492, that within Christian thought in Europe, within Catholic thought, just to be more specific, yes, that there is some notion of anti-Muslim sentiment embedded in that thought. Yes. Or, if you like, that this is something that is constantly a concern for Catholic writers, theologians, adherents, Islam as threat.
Yes.
And you see this, from the rise of Islam, and we might say until the present. So that is a constant threat. Of course, it changes over time. It depends where we're talking about and when. There's, infinite contingency here, granted. And yet, this is a constant threat. So how do we talk about something like that without getting into banal ideas about a clash of civilizations or unchanging war between Islam and Christendom? I do this partly in the book by showing that there were plenty of instances of quite positive and productive interactions between Muslims and Christians in cities, of course, between Muslim thinkers and Christian thinkers, etc. A bit deeper historiographically here, in an attempt, a laudable attempt, one that I support and am a part of, to get away from a notion of a clash of civilizations. When people talk about the early modern Mediterranean in the past few decades, we've become very interested in thinking about those who cross confessional lines, intermarriages between people from different faiths, people who convert and switch identities, these kind of shapeshifters, boundary crossing individuals. And there's been a lot of excellent work done there. And again, I'm supportive of that and do some of that myself. I think in certain cases, the pendulum has swung a little too far, to the point that in some of this work, it's as though religion doesn't matter in the early modern world anymore. And I think it does. Things like boundary crossing, identity shifting, all of that kind of interesting stuff is only true to a point. There comes a point where religion certainly does matter legally and theologically in the early modern Mediterranean. This is as true in Europe as it is in the Ottoman world. So in thinking about how to present this story of Columbus as a crusader, right? I both wanted to be true to that historiography and to restore that aspect of Columbus's biography, which is key to understanding everything that he does and has been lost for the most part. I wanted to do that without falling into the trap of an eternal battle between Christendom and Islam, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, in fact, you say in your book that, these people are so obsessed with Islam that they saw Islam everywhere. In fact, they saw mosques in Mexico, which is the most unlikely place, right? And then the American Indians wearing Moorish clothing and performing Moorish dances. They just saw Islam and Muslims everywhere. And you also go on to write in the book, if I may quote you from your book, towards the end of it, you say that the idea that Islam is a deep existential threat to the Americas is one of the oldest cultural tropes in the New World. Its history is as long as the history of European colonialism and disease. It must, therefore, be a part of any understanding of the history of the Americas. Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of sums up the obsession they had with Islam, or the fear of Islam, or threat of Islam, as you called it. In fact, you also mentioned the Spanish Catholic jihad against the Native Americans. Could you say something on that?
Sure. So, right. When you start reading the Spanish accounts of these early decades of colonization, Columbus, Cortez, several others, you come to see that there is this strange use of the language of Islam to describe Native Americans. So you mentioned Cortez saying he sees 400 mosques in Mexico. Most scholars agree that he's talking about Aztec temples of some kind.
Yes.
He calls Montezuma a sultan. The issue of Moorish dress, as you said, Moorish dancing, using this language. So part of the effort of my book is to try to understand why that is. And that gets us back to what we were talking about earlier, the kind of biography of these individuals in the old world and their interactions with Islam. So someone like Cortez, fights against Muslims in the old world. He comes to Mexico, what is today Mexico, and battles against Native Americans, and then fights again in North Africa towards the end of his life. So this kind of back and forth between fighting against Muslims and Native Americans for this first generation of Spaniards is something that a lot of them are shaped by. So the language of Catholic jihad, I borrow some of that language from a scholar named Patricia Seed, who has done a very close analysis of the same period that I'm talking about. And she points out that a lot of the Spanish practices of conquest in the Americas borrow heavily from Islamic practices in Spain. And so, for example, one is what the document known as the requirement.
The requirement, yes.
Yeah, yes, which I spent a chapter discussing. And again, I'm borrowing heavily from her in this part of the book. You know, she argues quite convincingly that the requirement borrows a lot of the language of Muslim declarations of war in the Old World. The idea that if one is given an opportunity to convert before battle, and if they take that opportunity, then they can save themselves from a war. She also analyzes land tenure practices, showing how a lot of the structure of property and of taxation comes from Muslim practices in Spain. Again, this is not surprising. In the same way that the Ottomans borrowed Byzantine practices quite early on in Anatolia, it's not surprising that after 700 years of Muslim rule in Spain, that once Catholics take over in certain places, that they would maintain some of those practices that had been in place for centuries, and then take those practices with them when they colonize the Caribbean. So, you know, that's again this kind of continuum between Old World and New World, in which Islam is in some ways the glue of that continuum in these aspects that I'm talking about.
So I think it was that fear that made the document called requirement, you know, forced to be recited by these people, right? And, you know, where they were forced to declare the creed of Christianity, where when they were asked to say that God our Lord, one and the eternal, created heaven and earth. God our Lord gave us charge of all peoples to one man named Saint Peter. So these were the kind of statements and creedal statements that were found in requirement. So I mean, that gives us an idea of how much they wanted to finish off or Islam, or the fear of Islam at least. And where does I mean, how does the conquest of Selim have influenced the modern world? I mean, Alan, in that sense, you know. I mean, you spoke about, you know, it kind of redefines the origins of the modern world. Your book kind of redefines the origins of the modern world. So how would you see Selim's contribution to this?
Right. So if you're asking me about Selim and Columbus, is that the question?
Yeah, it's not just about Selim and Columbus. I mean, how was the modern world shaped by the Ottoman conquest of Selim, right? Kind of.
Right. So you know, as we spoke before, if we look at the history of the Middle East, to understand the last 500 years of that history, we have to understand Selim's conquest, right? The empire that he builds, right, the expansion that he undertakes, affects the histories of some 33 modern countries, right? The borders of the empire at that point subsumed today some 33 modern countries. So to understand that history, we have to understand Selim. If we're talking, let's just stick with the Atlantic voyages for the moment. You know, Selim is governor in Trabzon in 1492. He has no direct kind of connection to Columbus, but the Ottomans do. It's the Ottomans pushing further west in the Mediterranean that is part of the story of why such drastic action is needed by someone like Columbus, to find an alternate route to the east, to get around this gargantuan power of the Ottomans and other Muslims in the Mediterranean in this period. So the Ottoman fear is embedded in the mindset of all these people. Yeah, so if we're talking about the Atlantic voyages, that's the impact of the Ottomans on that story. Yeah.
So would you go to the extent of saying that if the Native Americans were brutally attacked, was it because they were thought to be Muslims?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think to say that the Spanish Catholics thought they were Muslims, I think is too strong a statement. I think that some believe that there was some kind of continuity, perhaps, between Islam and Native America. Columbus, until he dies, he never understands that he's discovered a new, not discovered, but landed in new territory, right? He thinks he is in Asia. And if you think you're in Asia and you want to understand this place as something you know, you're going to seek out connections that may not exist. So I think that is part of the story, that he's grasping for some way of understanding this place that is so vastly different than anything he's ever encountered before. And what is the greatest difference that he's ever seen in his life? It is Islam. So I think that's one of the ways that he's trying to assimilate this new world into his mindset. You know, other Spaniards are very clear that this is new territory and that these people have nothing to do with Muslims. So, you know, I don't want to make too strong a point about that the Catholics thought Spaniards were Muslims, but to make the point that there is a reason that these early Spanish writers use the language of Islam to understand Native America. That is a choice that has to be explained and understood. They didn't use the language of anti-Judaism. They didn't use the language of, I don't know, anti-German sentiment. They used the language of Islam. And so why is that? That is curious and has to be explained. And so that's the reason that, you know, I spent a lot of time talking about the experience of the Ottoman-Spanish rivalry in the Mediterranean and how that shapes Spanish colonization.
That's correct. In fact, sorry, please go.
And just moving the story forward, you know, the quote from the end of the book that you read, you will see that much later, the kind of interactions between Europeans who go to the New World, their interactions with Islam are part of their biographies and part of explaining their actions in the Americas. So someone like John Smith, the first colonial governor of Jamestown, he, in the 17th century, he was enslaved in the Ottoman Empire for 2 years, right? He on his own personal seal, he has the severed heads of 3 Ottoman soldiers drawn onto his seal. He also sometimes borrows from the language of the Ottoman Empire, in his case, to speak about Native Americans. He says that the dress of a certain Native American chief reminded him of the dress of Turks that he encountered in the Ottoman Empire. In any case, when most people think of John Smith, they don't really think about this aspect of his biography, but it is a crucial part of understanding his story. And so some of the work of the book, as I do with Columbus and Cortez and then John Smith, just very briefly, is to bring back that story and to kind of dwell in that for a little bit and say, one, why have we either missed this or purposefully ignored this? And what does that say about our own politics of history writing and our understanding of the past? And if we were to take that history seriously, what would it mean for our narratives about the making of the modern world, the history of European colonization in the Americas, the history of the United States, the history of Jamestown, etc.?
In fact, coming back to Selim, I think before I hand over the floor to the participants for questions, I just want to ask one last question about Selim. Selim was basically he was son of a concubine, and also not the firstborn. So how significant is this thing, you know, to be a son of a concubine and also not the firstborn, to ascend to this kind of powers, right?
So to the first part of your question of being the son of a concubine, nearly every single Ottoman Sultan in 600 years of Ottoman history is the son of a concubine. This is how Ottoman Sultans created their heirs, is through sexual relations with concubines rather than their legal wives. So And there's a whole politics of that I discuss in the book that we could get into if you like. So the general point that we have to keep in mind is that once, and there are exceptions here, but once a concubine gave birth to a son, sexual relations between that woman and the Sultan ceased, and mother and son get tied together as a kind of dyad competing for power in the Ottoman world. And I spent a lot of time in the book discussing Gulbahar, Selim's mother, and Selim and their relationship and her place within Ottoman politics. So that's a very common phenomenon. I mean, and it's not just in the Ottoman world. In lots of dynastic families, concubines are the source of the heirs of the empire. Selim being a non-first son is rather exceptional and very important to his place in Ottoman history and to the story that I tell. Again, there were other instances in which non-firstborn sons and non-favored sons become sultans, but that's frowned upon in Ottoman dynastic politics. That is seen as a problem. Again, I get into a lot of detail about how Selim is able to turn his weaknesses and disadvantages into advantages, how he's able to outsmart his two older brothers. In his case, his eldest surviving half-brother, again, they each have different mothers, is favored to take over the throne, Ahmed. He's given every kind of advantage and favor in his early life and then in his imperial postings and those kinds of things. But Selim is able to overcome that. And he's also exceptional, not only for that reason, but because he forcibly deposes a living sultan. Again, very rare in Ottoman history and seen as a problem that has to be explained away. Once Selim deposes his father, Bayezid, you have a situation in which you have a current sultan, Selim, and the deposed sultan. And what does that mean for the health of the state? Is it possible that the deposed sultan might raise an army and move against his son to retake the throne? Does Selim have to dispatch his father because he's too much of a threat? All of these raise very tricky questions for Ottoman thinkers about sovereignty, dynastic politics, familial relations, etc. And this is part of the reason that later historians will often use very negative terms to talk about Selim, because they want to establish, they want to make sure that the precedent of a non-firstborn son forcibly taking over the throne and deposing his living father, that precedent does not get set in Ottoman dynastic politics. And this is part of the reason that Selim eventually becomes known as Selim the Grim in Turkish, Yavuz. There are several other reasons that he gains that epithet. He was quite violent as a person, for, all the evidence that we have points to that. He led the largest domestic massacre in Ottoman history until the end of the 19th century, when during the campaign against the Safavids, he massacres 40,000 of his own Shiite subjects in Anatolia. And this event is really important for the history of Shiites in Anatolia and around the world as a kind of a very bloody moment of commemoration. So he, there are many reasons that he's known as Selim the Grim, but in terms of the dynastic politics that you asked me about, he is exceptional in a number of ways.
In fact, the imperial intrigues, surrounding what you spoke about of the dyad of a concubine and a son. Once the son is born, the sexual relationship ceases with the sultan. So this dyad, and the intrigue surrounding most of these kind of dyads, it leads us to assume that Islam was nowhere in the picture, because as you know, Islam is an orthodox religion, and Ottoman Empire is supposed to be a caliphate also, and this caliphate is supposed to be rooted in Islamic teachings, especially the teachings of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet. So and the Quran frowns upon that, and the prophetic teachings also frown upon extramarital relationships, extramarital, sons, and in any kind of relationship, sons born out of an extramarital relationship. So therefore, your research I mean, what does it say about Islam itself, you know, in the Ottoman Caliphate? Because
Yeah.
from these intrigues, it would appear that, you know, Islam took a back seat in front of power. Power was the main thing.
I would agree with you there. Concubinage is a practice that has an Islamic lineage. So, you know, the legality of concubinage is not necessarily a problem.
They use the Mamalakat Aymanukum kind of concept. Yeah.
Right. But you know, your general point that the Ottomans were bad Muslims is, you know, I think generally right. I mean, of course, again, over 600 years of history, it depends who we're talking about, what period, which sultan. But it is the case, for example, you know, Ottoman historians often point this out. No Ottoman sultan ever went on Hajj, which is kind of striking in the sense that,
yes.
You know, for 400 years, the Ottomans ruled the entire territory between Istanbul and Mecca and Medina. Yeah. So one could argue that they could very easily have gone on Hajj.
Yes.
There are all kinds of reasons they didn't. It was a security risk. It's very far away. It leaves Istanbul empty, etc. Of course, many of them drank. There are all kinds of instances in which we could claim that they, you know, are being bad Muslims. I mean, you could say that about, I think, all kinds of leaders around the world and their own religiosity.
Even the other caliphates, Abbasids and Umayyads too, are guilty of these things.
Sure. But you know, sometimes but I think the way I think about this is that the rhetorical uses of Islam for the sultans is very important. It is a source of legitimacy. It is a source to establish the rightness of their rule, the correctness of the rule, their power on earth. And you know, being the caliphate of the seat of the caliphate is very important to the Ottomans. You know, I discuss in the book how with Selim's conquest of Mecca and Medina, a process begins whereby scholars from former Mamluk territories begin to congregate in Constantinople, in Istanbul, whereas they might not have previously, right? I mean, first of all, the city is only in the empire at this point for some 60 years. But, you know, Istanbul is not a center of Muslim learning in the way that Damascus or Cairo or Mecca was. But after Selim's conquests, many scholars begin migrating to Constantinople. And this begins a process over the course of a century or so, whereby Istanbul does become a center of Islamic learning, writing, and teaching. And so there are many ways in which leadership in the Muslim world is highly important for the Ottomans. Their own personal religiosity is one, harder to get at, and two, I think actually less important in understanding the place of the Ottomans in the Muslim world.
Actually, the import of my question was not to judge them by their religiosity, but I just wanted to get the facts right.
Yeah.
The one last question, because I'm tempted to ask this one last question. New Ottomanism is a term which we hear too often these days.
Yeah.
So how is there a nexus between this new Ottomanism? Because Erdogan is one of its proponents. So how would you see this?
Yeah. You're right. So Erdogan is unique amongst leaders of Republican Turkey for many reasons. One is his wholehearted embrace, patronage, and magnification of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. Many Republican leaders were very interested in separating the Turkish Republic from anything having to do with the Ottoman Empire. He has in many ways reversed that and supported it, the legacy of the empire in all kinds of ways. This means funding programs in universities, rebuilding historical sites, you know, the conversion of the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, all of these kinds of things. Of course, this is all for his own polemical political purposes. But as part of his neo-Ottomanist project, he has looked to various figures from the Ottoman past for inspiration, for example, and Selim is one of them. So we see this in numerous ways. The most obvious is that, and I mentioned this at the end of the book, during Erdogan's rule, he built the third bridge over the Bosphorus Straits,
yes,
the famous
yes.
Bosphorus Straits.
You mentioned that, yes.
Yeah, and you know, this is a gargantuan engineering feat. Anyone who's been to Istanbul knows that the Bosphorus is an enormous body of water. To build a bridge from Asia to Europe is no small feat, and that's why there's only 3 of these connectors. The first bridge was known simply as the Bosphorus Bridge. The second one was named after the conqueror of Constantinople, Mehmed II, so it's known as the Mehmed II Bridge, and Selim's grandfather. The third bridge that Erdogan had the opportunity to name, he could have named it after any figure in world history or from the president. He could have named it after himself, but he chooses to name it after Selim. Why is Selim important to Erdogan? I think Selim is a symbol of many things. One, it's a symbol of Turkish expansion in the Middle East, right? As I said, Selim leads the largest single expansion in Ottoman history. Erdogan has ambitions for regional power for Turkey in the Middle East. You see this in Libya, in Syria, of course, and other places. Selim as a symbol of the wedding of religious and worldly authority, right? Selim as the conqueror of Mecca and Medina, the first Ottoman caliph, all of this kind of stuff. Erdogan is an Islamist of a kind. And so that kind of wedding of Islam and worldly politics, I think, is attractive to him. And then, you know, what I spoke about before, Selim as the grim, someone who went after his domestic enemies, who was powerful, who was violent, who projected power into the world. That's something that is attractive to Erdogan as well. There are other figures, obviously, from the Ottoman past that Erdogan taps into. But again, Selim is one of the most powerful.
Thanks a lot. Absolutely fascinating. I didn't realize how we had spent 1 hour just in conversation. We thought of doing it for 40 minutes, but I think we have almost, it's more than 15 minutes now. I'm sure the participants must be eagerly waiting to interact with you.